October 23rd, 1944. The Vosges Mountains of northeastern France rose like ancient sentinels through the morning fog, their slopes thick with pine and beech forests that swallowed entire divisions whole. Private First Class. James Thornton of the 92nd Infantry Division crouched in a foxhole carved from frozen earth, watching his breath crystallize in the pre-dawn air. Around him, men from Company B prepared for what they believed would be another routine patrol through the dense woodland, a simple reconnaissance mission to probe enemy positions before the main advance. They had no idea that within 12 hours, everything they understood about courage, strategy, and the limits of individual action would be shattered by events so extraordinary that decades later military historians would still debate whether they could have actually happened. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded that October day would become one of the most remarkable and least documented episodes of the entire conflict, a story of how one soldier's combination of tactical brilliance, psychological insight, and sheer audacity would accomplish what an entire company could not, forcing hundreds of enemy troops to surrender without a single life lost on either side. James Thornton had been born in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1921, the third son of a sharecropper who had worked the same red clay soil his grandfather had tilled as an enslaved person. The Thornton family lived in a 4-room wooden house that leaned slightly to the left, its boards weathered grey by decades of sun and rain. James grew up knowing the weight of cotton sacks, the ache of stooping in endless rows under the brutal summer sun, and the particular exhaustion that comes from working someone else's land for a fraction of what your labor produced. His father, Abraham Thornton, was a quiet man, whose hands bore the permanent stains of soil, and whose back had developed a perpetual curve from 30 years of agricultural work. His mother, Esther, took in washing and ironing from the white families in town, her fingers raw from lye soap and scalding water. The Thornton children attended the colored school on the far side of the railroad tracks, a 1-room building that served grades 1 through 8, with a single teacher and textbooks so worn that the pages had to be turned with extreme care. James showed an aptitude for mathematics and geography, subjects that seemed to offer glimpses of worlds beyond the cotton fields and the rigid social boundaries of Depression-era Alabama. He would stay after school to study the maps on the wall, tracing with his finger the outlines of countries he had only read about in books. His teacher, Miss Claudia Morrison, recognized something in the quiet boy who asked endless questions about how distances were measured and how armies moved across different kinds of terrain. When James was 14, an incident occurred that would shape the rest of his life. He had been walking home from school along the dirt road that cut through the Turner plantation when he came upon a group of white boys, several years older, surrounding a stray dog they had cornered against a fence. They were taking turns throwing rocks at the terrified animal, laughing as it yelped and tried to escape. James knew the rules. He knew he should keep walking, keep his eyes down, mind his own business. But something in the dog's eyes, that mixture of fear and incomprehension, made him stop. He stepped between the boys and the dog, not saying a word, just standing there with his schoolbooks under his arm. The white boys fell silent, stunned by this violation of every unspoken rule they had been raised to enforce. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then James knelt down slowly and held out his hand to the dog. The animal hesitated, then crept forward and licked his fingers. James picked up the dog and started walking away. One of the boys found his voice and shouted after him, but James kept walking. He heard footsteps behind him and his heart hammered in his chest, but he did not run. He just kept walking at the same steady pace, the dog trembling in his arms. The footsteps stopped. When James finally looked back, the boys were gone. That night his father sat him down at the kitchen table. Someone had already told Abraham about the incident. The older man's face was tight with fear and anger in equal measure. He told James that what he had done was brave and foolish in equal parts, that courage without wisdom would get a colored man disappeared in the night. But he also said something else, something James never forgot. He said that sometimes a man had to draw a line, had to decide what kind of person he was going to be, and that once you drew that line, you had to be prepared to live with the consequences. James kept the dog, which he named Scout. The animal followed him everywhere, sleeping at the foot of his bed and waiting outside the school until lessons finished. Scout became a kind of companion in a world where true friendship across racial lines was forbidden and dangerous. Through Scout, James learned about loyalty, about trust, and about the strange alchemy by which two very different creatures could come to understand each other without words. When James turned 18 in 1939, the world was already sliding toward a conflict that would eventually consume millions of lives across multiple continents. Europe had erupted into open confrontation after the German regime's invasion of Poland in September of that year, and while America officially remained neutral, it was clear to anyone paying attention that the nation would eventually be drawn into the expanding maelstrom. James found work at a lumber mill outside Birmingham, operating a saw that could take a man's hand off if his attention wavered for even a second. The work was dangerous and exhausting, but it paid better than sharecropping, and he was able to contribute to his family's finances while saving a small amount for himself. He spent his evenings reading whatever newspapers he could find, following the progress of the conflict in Europe with the same fascination he had once brought to the maps in his schoolroom. The scope of the German military's early advances was staggering. Poland fell in 5 weeks. Denmark and Norway collapsed in a matter of days. France, which everyone had assumed would hold based on its performance in the previous global conflict, capitulated in just 6 weeks during the summer of 1940. James studied the maps and tried to understand how such rapid conquests were possible, what combination of strategy, technology, and psychology allowed one force to overwhelm another so completely. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 changed everything. James had been listening to the radio that Sunday afternoon when the regular programming was interrupted with the news. He sat very still as the announcer described the devastation in Hawaii, the ships burning in the harbor, the thousands already confirmed lost. He knew immediately that his life was about to change in fundamental ways. The armed forces had been segregated since their inception, with colored soldiers relegated to support roles and labor battalions, excluded from combat units by official policy and informal prejudice. But the massive expansion required by a two-front conflict meant that some of these barriers would have to bend, if not break entirely. In early 1942, the military began accepting colored volunteers for combat units, though these units would remain segregated and would often be assigned the most difficult and dangerous missions with the least adequate support. James enlisted in March 1942 at the recruitment office in Birmingham. The white sergeant who processed his paperwork looked at him with barely concealed contempt, asking him twice if he could read and write, seeming disappointed when James answered the qualification questions without difficulty. James was sent to Fort Huachuca in Arizona for basic training with thousands of other colored recruits who had volunteered to fight for a country that denied them basic civil rights. Fort Huachuca sprawled across the high desert of southern Arizona, a landscape of searing heat and dust storms that could strip paint from vehicles. The 92nd Infantry Division was being reconstituted there, the famous Buffalo Soldiers Division that had fought in the previous global conflict and in various border skirmishes since the 1800s. The men who arrived at Huachuca came from every corner of the country, from the industrial cities of the north to the rural south, from prosperous middle-class families to tenant farmers barely one generation removed from enslavement. What united them was a complicated mixture of patriotism, pragmatism, and hope. They were patriots who loved their country despite its manifest injustices. They were pragmatists who understood that military service might open doors that would otherwise remain forever closed. And they were hopeful that perhaps, just perhaps, proving themselves in the crucible of conflict might earn them the full citizenship and respect that had been denied their parents and grandparents. The training was brutal by design. The men ran obstacle courses in full gear under the merciless Arizona sun. They learned to strip and reassemble their weapons blindfolded. They practiced small unit tactics in the rocky hills, learning to move as coordinated teams rather than individuals. They studied map reading, first aid, communications protocols, and the 1,000 other skills required of infantry soldiers in modern mechanized conflict. James thrived in this environment. The physical demands were intense, but they were no worse than 10 hours in a cotton field or a double shift at the lumber mill. What fascinated him was the intellectual dimension of military training, the way that tactics and strategy involved solving complex problems with limited resources under conditions of uncertainty and stress. He discovered that he had an intuitive grasp of terrain and movement, an ability to read a map and visualize how forces would flow across different kinds of landscape. His squad leaders noticed this aptitude and began giving him additional responsibilities. But the training at Fort Huachuca existed within a larger context of prejudice and discrimination that never went away. The colored soldiers trained separately from white units. They were given older equipment and less adequate supplies. White officers often treated them with contempt, assuming they lacked the intelligence and courage for combat roles. The men endured all of this with a mixture of anger and determination, knowing that they would have to be twice as good to be considered half as capable. James became friends with a fellow soldier named Robert Chen, whose family had immigrated from China to San Francisco in the 1890s. Robert's father ran a laundry business in Chinatown, and Robert had graduated from the University of California before enlisting. The two men bonded over their shared experience of being seen as perpetual outsiders in the country of their birth, of being Americans who were constantly told they did not really belong. Robert had a quick wit and an encyclopedic knowledge of military history. He and James would spend their rare free time discussing famous campaigns and tactical decisions, debating what they would have done differently at particular battles. Another close friend was Marcus Washington from Detroit, whose father worked on the assembly lines at Ford. Marcus was built like a heavyweight boxer and had the temperament to match, quick to anger and quick to laugh. He had no patience for the discrimination they faced and frequently got into arguments with white soldiers and even officers, which resulted in repeated disciplinary actions. James often found himself acting as a mediator, calming Marcus down before his temper got him into serious trouble. The division spent nearly 2 years training in Arizona before finally receiving orders to ship overseas. In July 1944, the men of the 92nd Infantry Division boarded transport ships in Virginia and began the long journey across the Atlantic. The crossing took 2 weeks, with hundreds of men packed into the holds of Liberty ships that rolled sickeningly in the North Atlantic swells. James spent much of the voyage on deck when possible, preferring the cold wind and spray to the claustrophobic darkness below. They landed at Naples in late July, entering a theatre that had already seen brutal fighting up the length of Italy. The Allied forces had been pushing north for over a year, facing fierce resistance from German defensive positions that took advantage of Italy's mountainous terrain. The Italian campaign had become a grinding war of attrition, with gains measured in miles rather than tens of miles. Each hill and river crossing bought with blood and exhaustion. The 92nd Infantry Division was assigned to the Fifth Army under General Mark Clark and sent to the western sector of the Italian front, facing German positions along the Gothic Line in the Apennine Mountains. The terrain was brutally difficult, all steep ridges and narrow valleys, with roads that switchbacked endlessly, and villages perched on hilltops that could only be reached by exposed approaches. The German forces had spent months fortifying these positions, creating defensive works that exploited every natural advantage the landscape offered. James saw combat for the first time in early August during an attack on a fortified village north of Lucca. Company B was tasked with clearing a series of stone buildings that overlooked a critical road junction. The approach was across open ground with minimal cover, and the German defenders had excellent fields of fire from the elevated positions. James remembered the strange disconnection between his training and the reality of people actually trying to end his life. The way bullets made cracking sounds as they passed overhead, the acrid smell of cordite and dust, the confusion and noise that seemed to prevent any kind of coherent thought. The attack stalled under heavy defensive fire. Men went to ground behind whatever cover they could find, pinned down and unable to advance or retreat. James found himself pressed against a low stone wall with 4 other soldiers, trying to make himself as small as possible while figuring out what to do next. Through the chaos, he noticed something. The German fire was coming from 2 main positions: a machine gun nest in a church bell tower and a fortified house about 50 meters to the right. If someone could get close enough to suppress even one of those positions, the company could advance. Without really thinking about it, James started moving. He crawled along the stone wall to a drainage ditch that ran perpendicular to their line of advance. The ditch was filled with stagnant water and smelled terrible, but it offered concealment. He moved through the ditch for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, finally emerging behind a collapsed shed about 30 meters from the fortified house. From this angle, he could see a window where the German gunners were positioned. James pulled 2 grenades from his belt, pulled the pins and threw them in quick succession through the window. He pressed himself flat as the explosions tore through the interior of the house. The machine gun fire from that position stopped. With one position suppressed, the rest of Company B was able to advance and overwhelm the remaining defenders. The village was secured by nightfall. James received no official recognition for this action, but his squad leader, Sergeant Thompson, made a point of telling him he had done good work. More importantly, James learned something crucial about himself that day. He learned that in the chaos and terror of direct conflict, his mind became very clear and focused, rather than panicking. He found that he could observe, analyze, and act while others froze. This was not courage in any conventional sense. He had been just as terrified as anyone else. It was something else, some strange quality of temperament that allowed him to function effectively under conditions that reduced most people to pure instinct. Over the next 3 months, the division fought its way north through some of the most difficult terrain in Italy. They took villages and lost them again. They endured artillery bombardments that could turn a forest into a landscape of shattered tree stumps in minutes. They learned to dig foxholes in frozen ground and to sleep in shifts, always with someone on watch. They saw friends disappear in sudden explosions or fall to sniper fire from unseen positions. They adapted to the strange reality of conflict, where moments of intense violence alternated with long periods of boredom and discomfort. James found that he had a talent for small unit leadership, even though he was only a private first class. Other soldiers began looking to him during combat situations, following his lead without being explicitly ordered to do so. He had a way of staying calm that seemed to spread to the men around him, and his tactical instincts were increasingly proven correct by events. In September, the division was pulled off the line for rest and refitting. They spent 2 weeks in a rear area, sleeping in actual buildings, eating hot food, and trying to process everything they had experienced. James wrote long letters home to his family, though he could not tell them much about what he was actually doing or seeing. He wrote instead about the landscape, the ancient villages, the kindness of Italian civilians who shared what little they had with the Allied soldiers passing through. It was during this rest period that James learned his friend Robert Chen had been lost during an attack on a German strongpoint north of Florence. The news hit him hard. Robert had been planning to become a history professor after the conflict ended, had talked endlessly about the books he wanted to write, the students he would teach. Now he was gone, his potential erased in an instant by circumstances beyond any individual's control. James attended the memorial service and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that could adequately address the magnitude of the loss. By early October, the division was back on the line, this time in the Vosges Mountains along the French-Italian border. The strategic situation had evolved considerably over the summer and early autumn. Allied forces had landed in southern France in August and were pushing north, while simultaneously the main forces that had landed in Normandy in June were driving east across France toward the German border. The German military was conducting a fighting retreat, trying to establish defensive lines that could slow the Allied advance long enough for them to regroup and potentially negotiate some kind of settlement. The Vosges Mountains represented one such defensive position. The mountain range ran roughly north-south along the western edge of the Rhine Valley, covered in dense forests and cut by steep valleys. The German forces had established a series of fortified positions throughout the range, taking advantage of the terrain to create defensive works that would be extremely difficult to assault directly. The Allied strategy was to probe these positions, identify weak points, and attempt to outflank or infiltrate the defensive lines rather than attacking them head-on. Company B of the 92nd Infantry Division was assigned to a sector on the western slopes of the Vosges, facing German positions that overlooked the approaches to the town of Bruyères. Intelligence reports indicated that the sector was held by elements of a German infantry division that had been significantly depleted by recent fighting, but still represented a formidable defensive force. The American command wanted detailed information about the German positions, their strength, and their state of readiness. On the morning of October 23rd, Company B was ordered to conduct a reconnaissance patrol into the forested areas between the American lines and the German positions. The patrol would consist of 12 men under the command of Lieutenant Morrison, a white officer from Virginia who had been with the company since training at Fort Huachuca. James was selected as one of the scouts because of his demonstrated ability to move quietly and his skill at reading terrain. The patrol left their forward positions at 0600 hours, just as the sun was beginning to burn off the morning fog. They moved in a loose column through the pine forest, spacing themselves to minimize the damage from any single explosion or burst of fire. The forest was eerily quiet, with no bird calls or animal sounds, as if the creatures of the wood had learned to avoid areas where humans made conflict. James was walking point, 20 meters ahead of the main group. He carried his rifle at the ready and moved carefully, testing each footfall before committing his weight, watching for tripwires or disturbed earth that might indicate mines or other traps. The forest floor was covered in pine needles that muffled footsteps, and the morning air was cold enough that breath condensed into visible clouds. They had been moving for about 45 minutes when James noticed something unusual. There was a cleared area ahead, visible through the trees, and he could see what looked like a rough track or path cutting through the forest. He raised his hand to signal a halt and moved forward very slowly to investigate. As he approached the clearing, he realized what he was seeing. It was a supply route, a path that had been cut through the forest and reinforced with logs to allow vehicles to pass even in wet conditions. There were fresh tire tracks in the mud, indicating recent use. James moved back to where Lieutenant Morrison and the rest of the patrol were waiting and quietly reported what he had found. Morrison decided they should follow the supply route to see where it led, which would give them valuable intelligence about how the German forces were being resupplied. The patrol moved parallel to the track, staying in the tree line where they would be less visible. They followed the supply route for about 2 kilometers as it wound through the forest, gradually climbing toward higher elevations. The track led to a small valley that was invisible from the American positions, completely hidden by the surrounding ridgelines and thick forest. James signaled another halt as they reached a position overlooking the valley, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The valley contained a major German staging area. There were dozens of vehicles parked under camouflage netting, including trucks, light armor, and even a few self-propelled guns. There were supply dumps covered with tarps, communications equipment, and what looked like a field hospital. Most significantly, there were several hundred soldiers moving around the area, far more than intelligence had suggested were present in this sector. Lieutenant Morrison studied the scene through his binoculars, his face pale with the realization of what they had stumbled onto. This was not just a routine defensive position. This was a major concentration of forces that appeared to be preparing for some kind of operation. The Americans needed to know about this immediately. Morrison made the decision to pull back and report their findings. The patrol began to quietly withdraw the way they had come, moving carefully to avoid detection. They had made it about 500 meters back toward American lines when everything went wrong. A German patrol appeared without warning, emerging from a side path that intersected with their route. Both groups froze for a fraction of a second, equally surprised. Then someone fired and the forest erupted into chaos. James dove behind a fallen log as bullets ripped through the air around him. He could hear shouting in German and English, the crash of men moving through underbrush, the sharp reports of rifle fire. The firefight lasted only a few minutes but felt much longer. When it ended, 3 members of the American patrol were wounded, including Lieutenant Morrison, who had taken a round through his shoulder. The German patrol had broken contact and disappeared into the forest, presumably to alert their main force about the American presence. The situation was desperate. They were deep in German-controlled territory with wounded men who needed immediate medical attention. The German forces now knew they were there and would be organizing a response. Getting back to American lines before being cut off or overrun would require moving fast. But the wounded men could not move fast. Sergeant Thompson, who had taken command after Morrison was hit, made a quick decision. He would take the wounded men and sick soldiers and make a direct push back toward American lines, moving as quickly as possible. The remaining 4 soldiers, including James, would act as a rear guard, delaying any pursuit and giving the main group time to escape with the critical intelligence they had gathered. It was essentially a sacrifice play. The rear guard would almost certainly be captured or overcome, but their sacrifice would allow the intelligence about the German staging area to reach American commanders. Sergeant Thompson did not have to explain this to the men he was leaving behind. They all understood what was being asked of them. James watched the main group disappear into the forest, heading west toward safety. Then he and the 3 other soldiers of the rear guard began preparing their position. They found a spot where several large trees had fallen in a storm, creating natural barriers and cover. They positioned themselves to cover the most likely approaches and settled in to wait. The German response came about 20 minutes later. James heard them before he saw them, the sound of many men moving through the forest without much concern for stealth. They clearly knew the Americans were in the area and were conducting a methodical sweep to find them. The rear guard held their fire until the German soldiers were very close, then opened up with everything they had. The German forces reacted quickly, taking cover and returning fire. The exchange was intense but brief. The Americans were vastly outnumbered, and their position was being flanked on both sides. Within minutes, all 4 men of the rear guard were either wounded or out of ammunition. James had taken a grazing hit to his left arm that burned like fire, but was not immediately disabling. He raised his hands in surrender as German soldiers surrounded their position. The German officer in charge of the patrol was a lieutenant named Hans Becker, a career soldier in his early 30s who looked exhausted and older than his years. He spoke decent English and questioned James and the others about their unit, their mission, and what they had seen. The Americans gave only name, rank, and service number, as they had been trained to do. Becker did not press the issue. He had his men provide basic first aid to the wounded Americans, then organized them to be marched back toward the German positions. They walked for about an hour, escorted by a dozen German soldiers. James used the time to observe everything he could about his captors and their dispositions. The German soldiers looked tired and poorly supplied. Their uniforms were worn and patched. Several of them appeared to be quite young, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, not yet old enough to need regular shaving. They moved efficiently, but without the crisp precision James had expected from the much-feared German military machine. As they approached the staging area James had observed earlier, he began to revise his initial assessment of what he had seen. Yes, there were many vehicles and supplies, but looking more closely, many of the vehicles appeared to be in poor repair. The supply dumps were smaller than he had first thought, and while there were certainly several hundred soldiers present, they did not have the appearance of an elite combat unit preparing for offensive operations. They looked more like a depleted unit, trying to hold a defensive position with inadequate resources. The prisoners were taken to a farmhouse on the edge of the staging area that was being used as a temporary command post. Inside, they were separated and questioned again, this time by intelligence officers who spoke perfect English. James maintained his silence, offering nothing beyond the minimum required by military protocol. After about an hour, he and the other prisoners were taken to a barn that had been converted into a temporary holding facility for prisoners of war. There were already about a dozen other Allied soldiers in the barn, mostly American infantrymen who had been captured during recent operations. The guards were 2 older German soldiers who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. James sat down on a pile of straw and tried to think through his situation. He was a prisoner of war, deep behind German lines, with no immediate prospect of rescue or escape. The information about the German staging area may or may not have made it back to American commanders, depending on whether Sergeant Thompson and the others had successfully reached friendly lines. James's duty now was to survive, to resist giving the enemy any useful information, and to escape if an opportunity presented itself. But as James sat in that barn, watching the German soldiers going about their duties outside, something began to occur to him. The staging area he had seen was impressive at first glance, but the more he thought about what he had observed, the more it seemed designed to appear more formidable than it actually was. The vehicles were spread out and positioned for maximum visual impact. The supply dumps were carefully arranged to look larger than they really were. The soldiers were concentrated in the most visible areas. It was a deception, he realized. The Germans were trying to make their force look larger and more capable than it actually was, probably to discourage American attacks or to buy time for other units to withdraw or reposition. This was valuable intelligence, potentially more valuable than the simple fact of the staging area's existence. James needed to escape, not just to regain his freedom, but to get this analysis back to American lines, where it could influence operational planning. But escaping from a guarded barn in the middle of a German staging area would be almost impossible under normal circumstances. He would need to create very abnormal circumstances. Over the next several hours, James studied the patterns of the guards, the layout of the staging area visible through gaps in the barn walls, and the behavior of the German soldiers he could observe. He noticed several things. First, the guards changed every 4 hours, and during the change there were a few minutes when attention was divided. Second, there was a latrine about 30 meters from the barn that prisoners were allowed to use under escort. Third, there was a heavy truck parked near the barn that was being loaded with supplies, apparently preparing to move to another location. James also observed something crucial about the psychology of the German soldiers. They were tired and demoralized. They did not have the bearing of men who expected to win. They moved through their duties mechanically, without enthusiasm or aggression. These were men who had been pushed beyond their limits and were simply trying to survive until this nightmare ended. This observation gave James an idea, an audacious and probably insane idea, but one that might actually work given the specific circumstances he found himself in. Instead of trying to sneak away and escape through stealth, what if he did the opposite? What if he walked right through the front door, acting like he had every right to be there, and relied on confusion, exhaustion, and the desperate human desire to believe in authority? James began to prepare. He carefully cleaned and adjusted his uniform as best he could given the circumstances. He rehearsed what he would say, the tone he would use, the body language he would project. He waited for the right moment, the instant when circumstances would align to give him the best possible chance. That moment came at 1800 hours, just as the sun was setting and casting long shadows across the staging area. The guard shift was changing. The supply truck was almost fully loaded and the driver was doing a final inspection. Most importantly, there was a sudden commotion at the far end of the staging area as a vehicle backfired loudly, drawing everyone's attention in that direction. James stood up and walked toward the barn door with absolute confidence, moving like a man who had every right to be wherever he chose to be. The new guards, still settling into their positions, assumed he was being escorted by someone they could not see in the confusion. The old guards, preparing to leave, assumed the new guards were handling the situation. James walked out of the barn, across the open ground, straight toward the supply truck. He climbed into the back of the truck without hesitation, moving behind a stack of crates where he would not be immediately visible. His heart was pounding so hard he thought surely everyone could hear it. But he kept his breathing steady and his movements confident. Any sign of uncertainty or fear would trigger suspicion. The driver climbed into the cab, started the engine, and began driving away from the staging area. James had made it past the first impossible barrier. Now he just had to figure out where this truck was going and how to get away from it without being discovered. The truck drove for about 20 minutes along rough forest tracks, heading generally northeast away from both the staging area and the American lines. James risked looking out from behind the crates and saw they were passing through the staging area he had observed that morning from the ridgeline. In the fading light, he could see the truth of his earlier assessment. The vehicles were mostly empty hulks, positioned for visual effect. The supply dumps were largely camouflage netting over empty crates. The great German defensive position was a shell, a facade maintained by exhausted men who knew the end was approaching. The truck finally stopped at what appeared to be a forward command post, a collection of tents and vehicles in a small clearing. The driver got out and went to report to someone, leaving the truck unattended. James knew this was his chance. He slipped out of the truck and into the surrounding forest, moving quickly but quietly, putting distance between himself and the German positions. He was free, but he was also alone, behind enemy lines, with no weapons, limited supplies, and only a general sense of where the American positions might be. The temperature was dropping rapidly as night fell, and he had no shelter or warm clothing beyond his uniform jacket. Still, James felt a surge of elation. He had escaped. Against all reasonable odds, he had walked out of captivity through a combination of timing, confidence, and the exploitation of exhausted opponents. James began moving west, using the stars to navigate once it was fully dark. He avoided all roads and tracks, staying in the forest where he would be harder to spot. He moved carefully, testing each step, stopping frequently to listen for any sounds of pursuit or patrol activity. The forest at night was alive with sounds: wind in the trees, small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. James filtered through these sounds, listening for anything human, anything that would indicate danger. He walked through the night, stopping only briefly to rest. His wounded arm throbbed with each heartbeat, but did not seem to be getting infected. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, James found himself on a ridgeline that gave him a view of the valley below. He could see, perhaps 3 kilometers away, what looked like American positions. There was a town flying American flags, vehicles that looked like American models, the distinctive outline of American artillery pieces. But between James and safety was a valley that would certainly be patrolled or monitored by German forces. Crossing in daylight would be suicide. He needed to wait for nightfall, which meant spending an entire day motionless and exposed on this ridgeline, hoping no one discovered him. James found a spot beneath a fallen tree where he would be invisible from most angles and settled in to wait. The day passed with excruciating slowness. He was hungry, thirsty, and exhausted. Every sound made him tense, certain that he had been discovered, but no one came. The forest kept its secrets. As darkness fell again, James prepared to make his final approach toward American lines. This would be the most dangerous part of his journey. Nervous sentries had a tendency to shoot first and ask questions later, especially at night. James would have to identify himself clearly and hope he was not mistaken for an infiltrator or enemy scout. But as James began his descent from the ridgeline, he saw something that changed everything. There was movement in the valley below, lots of movement. A large group of soldiers was moving through the darkness, heading toward a pass that would lead them behind the American positions. James froze and watched, trying to understand what he was seeing. It took him several minutes to piece together the situation. The German forces were attempting a flanking maneuver, trying to get around the American positions and attack from an unexpected direction. The force was substantial, perhaps 200 soldiers, enough to cause serious damage if they achieved surprise. This must have been what the staging area was actually for, not defense but preparation for this flanking attack. James faced an impossible choice. If he continued toward American lines, he might make it to safety, but the flanking force would achieve surprise and probably overwhelm the American positions from behind. If he tried to intercept or delay the German force, he would almost certainly be captured or overcome, sacrificing his escape for uncertain benefit. He thought about his father's words from years ago, about drawing lines and deciding what kind of person you were going to be. He thought about Robert Chen, who would never get to teach history or write his books. He thought about all the men in Company B who were depending on sentries and patrols to warn them of approaching danger. James made his decision. He would stop the flanking attack or die trying. He moved quickly down the slope, angling to intercept the German column before they reached the pass. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how one man could possibly delay or stop 200 soldiers. Direct confrontation was obviously impossible. He had no weapons, no way to physically prevent their advance. But James did have something else. He had information, and he had insight into the psychological state of the German forces. They were exhausted, demoralized, operating on the ragged edge of collapse. They were following orders out of discipline and habit, not conviction or enthusiasm. Their entire staging area had been an elaborate deception, which meant they understood they lacked the resources for sustained operations. What if James could convince them that continuing their attack would be futile and suicidal? What if he could make them believe they were walking into a trap far more elaborate than anything they could overcome? People who are exhausted and frightened do not think clearly. They are susceptible to psychological manipulation, especially if that manipulation confirms their worst fears. James reached the pass before the German column, breathing hard from the exertion. He positioned himself where he would be visible, standing in the middle of the trail in a shaft of moonlight, making no effort at concealment. When the lead elements of the German force came around the bend and saw him standing there alone, they stopped in confusion. James began to speak in a loud, clear voice. He did not speak German, so he spoke in English slowly and clearly, trusting that at least some of the soldiers would understand. He told them they were surrounded. He told them that American forces had been tracking their movement for hours and had positioned multiple companies on the ridgelines overlooking the pass. He told them that artillery had been pre-registered on this location and forward observers were waiting for the signal to open fire. He told them they had walked into a trap. The German column had come to a complete halt. Officers were moving forward to see what was happening. James kept talking, his voice calm and confident, describing in detail the forces that supposedly surrounded them. He invented unit designations and weapon systems. He described fields of fire and kill zones. He spoke with absolute certainty, as if he were simply explaining obvious facts. An officer pushed through the crowd of soldiers, a captain whose uniform marked him as career military. He studied James for a long moment, trying to understand what was happening. He asked in English who James was and what authority he had to offer terms. James identified himself by name, rank, and unit. Then he said something that was either brilliant or insane, or both. He said he had been sent forward under a flag of truce to offer the German force one chance to surrender before the trap was sprung. He said that if they surrendered immediately, they would be treated according to the laws governing prisoners of conflict. If they attempted to continue their attack or to withdraw, the American forces would open fire and none of them would survive. The German captain stared at him. James could see the calculation happening behind the man's eyes. This had to be a bluff. One unarmed colored soldier standing alone in a mountain pass, claiming to represent overwhelming force. It was absurd. But what if it was not a bluff? What if the Americans really had tracked their movement and prepared an ambush? The captain had no way to verify the truth without committing his forces and potentially discovering too late that James was telling the truth. James pressed his advantage. He said the captain had 5 minutes to decide. He pulled out his empty hands as if checking a watch, though he had none. He said the American forces were under orders to open fire at exactly 2100 hours unless he returned with word of German surrender. The imaginary deadline created urgency, prevented the captain from taking time to think clearly or scout the surrounding terrain. The captain turned and spoke rapidly in German to his subordinates. James could not understand the words, but he could read the body language. The officers were arguing. Some wanted to call the bluff and continue the mission. Others were advising caution. The exhausted soldiers stood in uncertain silence, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. James waited, projecting absolute confidence while internally terrified. If the captain called his bluff, James would be captured again or simply eliminated as an obstacle. Everything depended on whether these exhausted, demoralized men could be convinced that their situation was hopeless. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, the German captain turned back to James. He said in careful English that he would agree to surrender on condition that his men be treated properly as prisoners of conflict under the appropriate conventions. James agreed immediately. He said the captain should have his men lay down their arms and remain in position while James returned to American lines to arrange for the formal surrender. This was the most dangerous moment. If James left and the Germans realized they had been bluffed, they could simply pick up their weapons and continue with their mission. But James understood that the captain needed a way to save face, needed some kind of procedure that made the surrender seem reasonable rather than cowardly. By treating this as a formal negotiation rather than a bluff and surrender, James gave the captain that cover. James turned and walked away up the trail, moving at a measured pace that suggested confidence rather than fear. He did not look back. He walked for about 500 meters until he was certain he was out of sight. Then he ran. He ran with everything he had, racing toward the American positions, knowing that he had minutes at best before the German force either changed their minds or discovered the deception. He reached the American lines just before 2100 hours, nearly stumbling into a forward observation post manned by soldiers who almost fired on him before he identified himself. In gasping, frantic sentences, James explained who he was, where he had been, and what he had just done. The soldiers stared at him in disbelief. Within minutes, James was brought before the battalion commander, a major named Henderson, and gave a more coherent report. He explained about his capture, his escape, his observation of the German flanking force, and his improbable gambit in the mountain pass. Henderson listened with an expression that suggested he thought James might be suffering from exhaustion-induced delusions. But the possibility that there actually was a German force waiting to surrender in the mountains could not be ignored. Henderson organized a company-strength force with supporting weapons and artillery on call, and led them back into the mountains following James's directions. James went with them, still unarmed, still wearing his torn and dirty uniform, running on pure adrenaline and willpower. They reached the pass at approximately 2200 hours, 90 minutes after James had walked away from the German captain. Henderson had his men spread out and take defensive positions on the surrounding ridgelines before announcing their presence. If the Germans had discovered the bluff and were lying in ambush, Henderson was not going to walk into it. But when the American forces illuminated the pass with powerful spotlights mounted on vehicles, they found exactly what James had promised. Nearly 200 German soldiers sat on the ground, with their weapons stacked in neat piles. Their officers stood in a group, waiting. When Major Henderson and James walked into the lighted area, the German captain from before stepped forward and formally surrendered his command. The American soldiers could not believe what they were seeing. The German prisoners outnumbered them substantially. If the Germans had chosen to fight, the outcome would have been uncertain at best. But they had not fought. They had surrendered to one unarmed soldier who had convinced them through sheer audacity and psychological insight that continuing was hopeless. The processing of the prisoners took most of the night. Each German soldier was searched, documented, and organized for transport to rear-area prison camps. The captured weapons and equipment were catalogued and secured. Intelligence officers questioned the German captain and his staff about their unit, their mission, and their overall situation. What emerged from these interrogations confirmed James's assessment. The German force was the remnants of a battalion that had been battered by months of continuous fighting and retreating. They were undersupplied, undermanned, and exhausted beyond measure. Many of the soldiers were recent conscripts with minimal training. Others were veterans who had seen too much and no longer believed in final victory. They had been ordered to conduct the flanking attack as a desperation measure, and most of them had not expected to survive it. When James had appeared and offered them a way out that allowed them to survive with honor intact, they had taken it. The captain later told interrogators that he had been almost certain James was bluffing, but the alternative, continuing into what might actually be a trap, seemed worse than surrendering to a possible deception. As dawn broke over the Vosges Mountains on October 25th, James Thornton sat on a supply crate outside the battalion command post, drinking terrible coffee and trying to process what had happened. In less than 48 hours, he had gone from reconnaissance patrol to prisoner, to escapee to captor. He had single-handedly convinced an entire German battalion to surrender through nothing but psychology and nerve. Major Henderson approached and sat down beside him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Henderson said that what James had done was either the bravest or the craziest thing he had seen in 30 years of military service, and he still was not sure which. He said James would be recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valor. He said James's actions had probably saved dozens of American lives and had captured a significant enemy force without firing a shot. James just nodded, too tired to formulate a coherent response. All he could think about was sleep and food, and maybe writing a letter home to tell his family he was alive. The heroism and the recognition seemed less important than those immediate human needs. But as news of what James had done spread through the American forces in the sector, his accomplishment took on larger symbolic significance. Here was a colored soldier fighting for a country that denied him basic civil rights, who had demonstrated courage and tactical brilliance that exceeded anything expected of him. The story of the lone soldier who captured a battalion spread rapidly, losing nothing in the retelling. For the military establishment, James's achievement created a complex set of reactions. On one hand, it was undeniable proof that colored soldiers could perform with exceptional valor and skill when given the opportunity. This supported the arguments of those who wanted to see fuller integration of the armed forces. On the other hand, acknowledging James's achievement too prominently would raise uncomfortable questions about why it had taken so long to give colored soldiers combat roles, and what other talented men had been wasted in labor battalions and support roles. The compromise was typical of military bureaucracy. James received his Distinguished Service Cross in a small ceremony attended mainly by men from his own unit. The citation was written in dry official language that captured the facts but little of the audacity and brilliance of what he had actually done. There was no press coverage, no publicity beyond the military newsletter that circulated among units in the theater. James was promoted to sergeant and given command of his own squad within Company B. He continued fighting through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945, participating in the final pushes into German territory as the conflict drew toward its inevitable conclusion. He distinguished himself in several more engagements, though none as dramatic as his solo capture of the German battalion. Robert Chen's sister sent James a letter in March of 1945, thanking him for being her brother's friend and asking if James could tell her anything about Robert's final days. James spent an entire evening composing a response, trying to capture who Robert had been, his wit, his knowledge, his dreams for the future. He told her that Robert had died quickly, that he had not suffered. Though James had no way of knowing if this was true, sometimes small lies were kinder than complex truths. The conflict in Europe ended in May 1945 with the German surrender. James was in Bavaria when the news came through, and he watched as soldiers around him celebrated, firing weapons into the air, shouting, crying with relief that they had survived. James felt oddly disconnected from the celebration. He was grateful to have survived, but he kept thinking about all those who had not, Robert and countless others whose names he had known or never learned. The 92nd Infantry Division remained in Europe for several months after the German surrender, performing occupation duties and processing the vast numbers of prisoners and displaced persons. James used this time to take correspondence courses, working toward completing his high school equivalency. The Army had education programs for soldiers who wanted to better themselves, and James took full advantage. In November 1945, James finally boarded a transport ship in Marseille for the journey home. The crossing was nothing like the tense, dangerous voyage over in 1944. The Atlantic was at peace. There were no submarines to fear, no convoys to maintain. The men played cards, told stories, and dreamed about their futures. James arrived in New York in late November and was processed through the separation center at Fort Dix, New Jersey. He received his discharge papers, his final pay, and the various benefits due to returning veterans. Then he boarded a bus for the long journey back to Alabama, back to Birmingham, back to a world that had not changed nearly as much as the men returning to it. His family met him at the bus station. His parents, his two brothers, his younger sister. They had aged in the 3.5 years he had been gone, his father's hair gone almost completely grey, his mother thinner than he remembered. But their smiles and tears were genuine, and for a moment James allowed himself to believe that maybe things would be different now. Maybe his service and sacrifice would mean something in the country he had fought for. The reality was more complicated. The colored soldiers who had fought in the conflict came home to find the same segregated society they had left. There were no parades for the men of the 92nd Infantry Division in Birmingham. No one thanked them for their service or acknowledged their sacrifice. The local newspapers barely mentioned their return. James found work at the same lumber mill where he had been employed before the conflict. The owner grudgingly rehired him, making it clear he was only doing so because the law required that returning veterans be given their old jobs back. James settled back into the familiar rhythm of mill work, operating the same saws, hauling the same lumber, earning the same inadequate wages. But something fundamental had changed in James during his time in uniform. He had seen Europe, had commanded men in life-or-death situations, had demonstrated capabilities that no one in Birmingham would ever acknowledge or value. He had captured an entire battalion through brilliance and courage, and now he was expected to be grateful for a job in a lumber mill, where white men with a fraction of his abilities were promoted over him. In the evenings, James attended meetings of the local chapter of a veterans organization that was beginning to agitate for civil rights. The returning soldiers had a clarity about injustice that previous generations had often lacked. They had fought for democracy overseas and were determined to claim it at home. James became involved in voter registration drives, in challenges to segregated facilities, in the early stirrings of what would eventually become the broader civil rights movement. In 1948, President Truman signed an executive order officially desegregating the armed forces, acknowledging what men like James Thornton had already proven, that courage and capability had nothing to do with skin color. James read about the order in the newspaper and felt a mixture of satisfaction and bitterness. Better late than never, he supposed, though it came too late for Robert Chen and thousands of others who had died in segregated units. James married in 1950 a woman named Dorothy Williams, who taught at the colored school in Birmingham. They had 3 children over the next 8 years, and James worked multiple jobs to provide for his growing family while Dorothy continued teaching. He told his children stories about the conflict, though he softened the details, focusing on the landscape and the people he had met, rather than the violence and fear. In 1964, James's oldest son, Abraham, named after his grandfather, was arrested during a civil rights demonstration in Birmingham. James went to the jail to post bail and found his son sitting in a cell with dozens of other young protesters, singing freedom songs and refusing to be intimidated. Looking at his son's determined face, James felt a surge of pride mixed with fear. Abraham had inherited his father's willingness to draw lines, to decide what kind of person he was going to be. The civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s brought changes that James's parents could never have imagined. Segregation was officially ended, though its effects would linger for generations. Voting rights were protected, at least on paper. Colored men and women began to be elected to offices previously closed to them. The society was transforming, slowly and incompletely, but transforming nonetheless. James lived to see his grandchildren attend integrated schools, to see a colored man become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to see opportunities open that would have been unthinkable in his youth. He never talked much about his military service, especially not about that night in October 1944 when he convinced 200 exhausted soldiers to surrender. It seemed, in retrospect, like something that had happened to a different person in a different world. In 1993, a military historian researching the 92nd Infantry Division came across references to James's capture of the German battalion. The historian, a woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison, tracked James down in Birmingham and asked if she could interview him about his experiences. James, now 72 years old and recently retired from the lumber mill after 48 years of service, agreed. Dr. Morrison spent 3 days interviewing James, recording hours of testimony about his childhood, his military service, and his life after the conflict. She was particularly fascinated by the psychological dimensions of his confrontation with the German battalion, the way he had identified and exploited their vulnerabilities through insight rather than force. The resulting book, published in 1995, was titled The Capture: One Soldier's Extraordinary Achievement in World War II. It told James's story in detail, based on his testimony, military records, and interviews with surviving members of Company B, and even 2 of the German soldiers who had surrendered that night. The book was critically acclaimed and brought James a degree of recognition he had never sought or received. There were speaking engagements at schools and veterans organizations. There was an article in a major magazine with photos of James in his old uniform, his Distinguished Service Cross pinned to his chest. There was even a ceremony at which James received additional recognition from military officials and political leaders who wanted to be associated with his story. James accepted all of this with good humor and humility, always deflecting attention from himself and instead talking about the other men of the 92nd Infantry Division, the collective sacrifice and achievement that should be remembered and honored. He said that what he had done in October 1944 was not really heroism, just a combination of desperation, psychology, and good luck. But those who read Dr. Morrison's book understood that James was being too modest, that what he had accomplished required genius and courage in equal measure. In his final years, James became a kind of living symbol of the complicated history of colored Americans in military service. He represented both the extraordinary capabilities of soldiers who had been systematically underestimated and excluded, and the bitter reality of how their achievements had been ignored or minimized by a society unwilling to acknowledge their full humanity. James Thornton died in 2003 at the age of 82, surrounded by his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including veterans from multiple conflicts, civil rights activists, historians, and political leaders. The eulogy described him as a hero, a pioneer, and a man who had lived his life according to principles of courage and dignity. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from his grandson, a major in the now fully integrated army, who told the story of that October night in the Vosges Mountains. He described how his grandfather, alone and unarmed, had faced down hundreds of armed soldiers and convinced them through sheer force of personality and tactical brilliance to lay down their weapons. He said that story captured everything essential about James Thornton: his courage, his intelligence, his understanding of human psychology, and his refusal to accept that anything was impossible. The German captain who surrendered to James that night, Karl Becker, survived the conflict and returned to his family's farm in Bavaria. In the decades after, he rarely spoke about his military service or about the humiliating night when he had surrendered his entire command to one unarmed American soldier. But in 1996, after reading Dr. Morrison's book, he wrote a letter to James. In the letter, Becker said he wanted James to know that surrendering that night was the best decision he had ever made. He had saved the lives of 200 men, many of them boys who went on to have families and careers and full lives they never would have known if they had continued that doomed flanking attack. Becker said he had often wondered about the colored soldier who had faced him in the moonlight and convinced him that further resistance was futile. He said he had known, even at the time, that James was probably bluffing, but that knowing something intellectually and being willing to stake lives on that knowledge were very different things. Becker wrote that in the years since the conflict, he had come to believe that true courage was not about fighting when you had no choice, but about making the difficult decisions that saved lives rather than taking them. By that measure, he wrote, both he and James had demonstrated courage that night, James through his audacious gambit, and Becker through his willingness to prioritize survival over pride. James wrote back, and the two men corresponded for several years until Becker's death in 1999. They never met in person, but their letters covered a wide range of topics: family, philosophy, the lingering trauma of the conflict, the difficulty of explaining their experiences to people who had not been there. It was an unlikely friendship born from a bizarre circumstance, and it gave both men a kind of peace that had eluded them for decades. The full story of what James Thornton accomplished in October 1944 eventually became part of the curriculum at military academies and leadership schools. His capture of the German battalion is studied as a masterclass in psychological operations, in the exploitation of enemy weaknesses, and in creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. Military theorists have written papers analyzing exactly what James did and how it worked, breaking down the elements of his approach into teachable principles. But what cannot be taught or analyzed is the specific combination of courage, desperation, insight, and timing that allowed James to pull off something that should have been impossible. Every military operation occurs within a unique context of personalities, circumstances, and chance. James's achievement was unrepeatable precisely because it depended on so many factors aligning in just the right way at just the right moment. The lumber mill where James worked for 48 years closed in 2007. Its operations moved overseas where labor was cheaper. The building sat empty for several years before being converted into a community center that offers job training and educational programs for young people in Birmingham's colored neighborhoods. In 2010, the center was renamed the James Thornton Community Center in recognition of his military service and civil rights activism. James's children and grandchildren have gone on to careers that would have been impossible in his generation. His oldest son, Abraham, became a federal judge. His daughter Sharon earned a doctorate in history and teaches at a major university. His youngest son, Michael, served in the army for 25 years and retired as a colonel. His grandchildren include doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, artists, and soldiers. They are the living legacy of James's struggles and sacrifices, proof that progress, however incomplete and imperfect, is possible. The old farmhouse in Alabama where James grew up still stands, though it has been expanded and modernized beyond recognition. The cotton fields are gone, replaced by subdivisions and commercial development. The one-room school, where Miss Claudia Morrison taught James geography and mathematics, is long gone. But there is a historical marker on the site explaining its significance. The world James knew as a child has vanished, transformed by time and social change into something his younger self could never have imagined. In the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, there is a permanent exhibit dedicated to the service of colored soldiers in the conflict. James Thornton's story features prominently, with photographs, documents, and a video presentation that explains what he accomplished and why it mattered. School groups tour the exhibit and learn about the Buffalo Soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, about the barriers they faced and the achievements they accomplished despite those barriers. The exhibit includes a reproduction of James's Distinguished Service Cross alongside the citation, explaining why it was awarded. It includes photographs of James in uniform, young and serious, looking into the camera with an expression that suggests he has already seen things that have aged him beyond his years. It includes a map of the Vosges Mountains with the location marked where James encountered the German battalion, and it includes excerpts from his interviews with Dr. Morrison, his own words describing what happened and what he was thinking during those extraordinary hours. What the exhibit cannot fully capture is the complexity of James's feelings about his military service and what came after. He was proud of what he accomplished, proud of the men he served with, proud that he had done his duty when called upon. But he was also angry about the discrimination he faced, bitter about the opportunities denied, frustrated by how long it took for his achievements to be recognized. These contradictory emotions existed simultaneously, and James never fully resolved them. Perhaps that unresolved complexity is itself part of the story worth telling. The military's official history of operations in the Vosges Mountains in October 1944 includes a detailed account of James's capture of the German battalion. The account is based on after-action reports, interviews with participants on both sides, and analysis of captured German documents. It confirms the essential facts of the story, while acknowledging that some details remain uncertain or disputed. What is certain is that on October 24, 1944, Private First Class James Thornton, a colored soldier from Birmingham, Alabama, convinced approximately 200 German soldiers to surrender without firing a shot. This achievement stands as one of the most unusual and psychologically sophisticated individual actions of the entire conflict. It demonstrated that warfare is not just about firepower and numbers, but about understanding human psychology, exploiting enemy weaknesses, and having the courage to attempt what seems impossible. The German soldiers who surrendered that night were sent to prisoner camps in France and later in the United States. They spent the remainder of the conflict and several months after working on farms and in other labor capacities, generally under humane conditions. Most returned to Germany in 1946 and tried to rebuild their lives in a country that had been physically and morally devastated by years of totalitarian rule and aggressive conflict. Some of those German soldiers later wrote about their experiences as prisoners, and several mentioned the night they surrendered in the Vosges Mountains. Their accounts generally confirm James's version of events, though naturally they emphasize different aspects. They remember the exhaustion, the sense that the conflict was already lost, the relief when someone offered them a way to survive with honor. They remember the lone American soldier standing in the moonlight, speaking with absolute confidence about forces and preparations that may or may not have existed. One former German soldier, writing in his memoirs published in the 1970s, said that the American soldier who took their surrender was the bravest man he had ever encountered. This soldier, whose name was Friedrich Schneider, wrote that it took extraordinary courage to face down hundreds of armed men with nothing but words and nerve. He wrote that he had seen many acts of physical courage during the conflict, men running into fire to rescue wounded comrades, soldiers holding positions against overwhelming odds. But he had never seen anything quite like what that American soldier did in the mountain pass. The psychological analysis of James's achievement has continued to evolve over the decades. Early accounts focused on the deception involved, the bluff he pulled off. Later, analyses emphasized the psychological insight James demonstrated, his ability to read the enemy's state of mind and identify their vulnerabilities. More recent studies have looked at the cultural and racial dimensions of the encounter, examining how James's identity as a colored American soldier may have complicated the German soldiers' responses and decision-making. Some theorists have suggested that the German captain and his men may have been particularly susceptible to James's psychological gambit, precisely because James defied their expectations. The German military had been taught to view colored people as inferior, and encountering a colored soldier who demonstrated such tactical brilliance and psychological sophistication may have been profoundly disorienting. This cognitive dissonance might have made it harder for them to think clearly and evaluate James's claims critically. Others have argued that James's race was largely irrelevant to what happened, that any soldier with his specific combination of insight, timing, and courage could have accomplished the same thing under similar circumstances. This interpretation emphasizes the universal aspects of James's achievement rather than the racial dimensions. The truth, as is often the case with complex historical events, probably lies somewhere between these interpretations. James's identity certainly shaped his experiences and perspective in ways that influenced his actions. But his achievement was fundamentally about individual agency and tactical brilliance that transcended any single identity category. What remains undeniable is that James Thornton accomplished something extraordinary that night in the Vosges Mountains. He faced an impossible situation and found a solution that saved lives on both sides while achieving his military objective. He demonstrated that individual courage and intelligence could sometimes accomplish what entire units could not. And he proved, beyond any doubt, that the military establishment's prejudices about colored soldiers were not just morally wrong, but also strategically foolish. The broader story of colored soldiers in the Second World Conflict has gradually received more attention and recognition in recent decades. The tattered remains of prejudice and discrimination that these men faced, both within the military and in civilian society, are now more widely acknowledged. Their achievements, long minimized or ignored, are now properly celebrated. But this recognition came too late for most of the men who actually served, who returned from the conflict to find their contributions dismissed and their sacrifices unacknowledged. James Thornton was fortunate to live long enough to see some recognition of what he and his fellow soldiers had accomplished. He was able to tell his story, to see it documented in Dr. Morrison's book, to speak to young people about his experiences. But thousands of other colored veterans died without ever receiving the recognition they deserved, their stories lost to time and indifference. This is perhaps the deeper tragedy beneath James's individual story. Not just what he had to overcome to achieve what he did, but how many others like him never got the chance to demonstrate their capabilities because opportunity was denied based on nothing but prejudice and fear. How many other James Thorntons worked in lumber mills and cotton fields when they could have been leaders and innovators? How much potential was wasted? How many contributions were never made because society refused to see past skin color? These are not abstract questions. They represent millions of individual lives shaped and constrained by artificial barriers, millions of paths not taken because they were blocked by deliberate injustice. James Thornton's achievement in October 1944 stands as a testament to what was possible when barriers were overcome, and simultaneously as an indictment of all the times and places where those barriers remained firmly in place. In the end, what James Thornton did that night in the Vosges Mountains was prove something that should never have needed proving, that courage, intelligence, and tactical brilliance have nothing to do with race or background. That capability cannot be predicted or limited by superficial categories. He demonstrated these truths in the most direct and undeniable way possible by accomplishing something that military historians still study and analyze 7 decades later. The story has been told and retold in various forms over the years. It has been the subject of documentary films, academic papers, museum exhibits, and even a television dramatization that took considerable liberties with the facts. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects of the story, shaped by the concerns and interests of different eras and audiences. But at the core of all these retellings is the same fundamental narrative: one man, alone and unarmed, facing overwhelming opposition and finding a way to prevail through insight and courage rather than force. It is a story that resonates because it speaks to something universal about human potential and the power of individual agency. It reminds us that circumstances do not completely determine outcomes, that creative thinking and moral courage can sometimes overcome what seem like insurmountable obstacles. James Thornton would probably be uncomfortable with some of the ways his story has been told and used. He was fundamentally a modest man who deflected attention and praise, who always emphasized the collective achievements of his unit rather than his individual actions. But modesty does not change facts. And the fact is that what James accomplished in October 1944 was genuinely extraordinary by any reasonable measure. The German battalion that surrendered to James was designated Kampfgruppe Schmidt, a scratch unit assembled from remnants of various formations that had been battered during the long retreat across France. Its nominal strength was supposed to be around 600 men, but by October 1944 it numbered only about 230. These men were a mixture of combat veterans exhausted by years of continuous fighting and fresh conscripts with minimal training. The battalion's commanding officer, Captain Karl Becker, was 32 years old and had been in the military since 1935. He had fought in Poland, France, and on the Eastern Front before being transferred to the West in mid-1944. He was not a political fanatic or an ideologue. He was a professional soldier doing his duty as he understood it, trying to keep his men alive in a conflict he increasingly realized could not be won. When Becker encountered James Thornton in that mountain pass, he made a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life, though ultimately he came to believe it was the right decision. He chose survival over glory, wisdom over pride. In doing so, he saved 230 lives and demonstrated a kind of moral courage that does not receive medals or recognition, but is no less real for that. The meeting between James Thornton and Karl Becker in the darkness of the Vosges Mountains was a confrontation between two fundamentally decent men, trapped in circumstances beyond their control, representing political systems and ideologies neither of them had created. Their encounter lasted perhaps 15 minutes, but its consequences rippled outward through decades and across continents. The families of the German soldiers who surrendered that night went on to live their lives unaware in most cases of how close they came to losing husbands and fathers and sons. Children were born who would never have existed if that flanking attack had continued. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren now living in Germany, America, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere owe their existence in part to a series of decisions made in a mountain pass on a cold October night in 1944. This is the hidden calculus of conflict and peace, the uncounted lives and unlived futures that depend on individual decisions made under pressure. When James Thornton chose to attempt his impossible bluff rather than trying to escape to safety, and when Karl Becker chose to accept surrender rather than calling that bluff, they set in motion a cascade of consequences that can never be fully traced or understood, and that conclude.